to who their end users are, and understanding what they're like, not only to see how they interact with the system, but who they are as a person, who they, what motivates them on a daily basis, what motivates them to get out of bed, what motivates them to do everything. And we really try and understand the real detail of that person and that personality. That helps us to make design decisions down the line. So where in personas development that I've briefly shown you now is that certain companies and certain people approach them very differently. One of our main strengths is persona development, and really refine that process over time to make this deliverable very unique. So here's an example. It's very small on screen, unfortunately, but if I had it larger, you'd be able to see it better. So we've kind of, like I say, refined the whole UCD process to take the person, the user, on a journey. And the first thing to establish is who that person is. And the way we try and do it, we try and give them in a kind of passport and a persona that shows kind of a flight process. So the first thing you do when you go to an airport and you check into a flight is you hand over a passport. And what does that tell you? It tells you all the details about that person. So we kind of have this kind of, this persona layout that kind of shows that person in a summary. So we have different elements to this persona. So we have the passport, like I've mentioned, the boarding pass, which shows the goals and objectives of that person and what they're trying to achieve from taking on this journey. A little user story. So we have this instruction card that tells them about the person, who they are, what their background, what they've done before, and little bits about them that help you understand more about that person. So whether they have a family or whether they're they're young and the early days in their career, for example. You then have the kind of motivation section that sort of breaks down the sort of intrinsic and extrinsic level of motivation and tries to understand how important these metrics are to each person, because each one of these, like I say, it helps you make design decisions later down the line. These are very important for not only the very early stage, but later on to validate your designs and to continue working with that. Because once you get to the wireframe stage in any project, it's very easy just to forget about the person and just think about what you've got to do based upon the requirements. But if you have this, whether it's posted around on the walls or whether it's just easily attainable, it makes you come back to it and understand who that user is.
It's really about trying to humanize our users. You can think of users, but actually we use the term all the time, but actually I really hate the term user because it really makes you think of them in a functional way. Where actually, if you think of them in a more humanistic way, you actually really understand what drives them, what they will respond well to, what the impact will be. And they're the kind of things that will influence sort of design, because design is that kind of subjective and emotional and interactive connection. So kind of functionality doesn't really drive that relationship as strongly as the personality side. So using the example like what Duncan has shown there is really just trying to find more visually engaging ways to represent that audience. And we've got sort of lots of different templates of different styles and ways you can present it. This just happens to be the sort of our most popular current one, where we really showed it as he says, a passenger about to take a journey. So you really feel as though that's what they're going to do. I need to know who this guy is, where's he trying to go to, and what does he need to experience along that way. So if you think of them as a person taking a journey, you're more likely to design that journey in that way. Whereas if you just think of them functionally and practically, you'll miss out all of those soft details, which being a designer is really all about focusing on that.
Moving on then, this is an example of one of our user journeys. So typically sort of user journeys and process design is all about boxes and arrows and sort of flat and generally quite boring approach. Nobody likes to really just work with boxes and arrows. We try and make it a little bit more fun, a little bit more creative, something that anyone can pick up and understand, whether you're technical or not, or a complete novice. This is just one of our examples. We try and use visual symbology and visual language to, like I say, help people understand things quicker and easier. So this is a typical design of the London tube map. So You know, we've broken this down so you've got the different stations, so they could be part of the navigation, for example. If the user takes a specific route, they get 3 options. This helps you decide which route they go down. It just helps you break down visually in a more impactful way. That's all right. Okay. We also use, just recently, we've played more on this sort of taking them on a journey and taking them through a flight. So we've used this flight symbology. So when you go into an airport, you see certain symbols. That's quite universal. You know, everybody around the world generally that can understand the visual symbols that are used in airports, and we've kind of used that in our documentation as well. So people in London can pick it up and understand it straight away. People in Saudi Arabia can pick it up straight away. People in Dubai, people in Australia. It's just, you know, it's something that we can all pick up and understand, not just people locally.
The idea really is, for us, you know, we really try hard to find ways to better communicate the user experience process, because, you know, certainly if you have clients or stakeholders who really don't understand the process, just sort of putting wireframes or journeys or sitemaps under them, it's a quite unengaging process because they don't see the value of the final output. So I mean, over time, that's why we've come up with so many different visual styles and toolkits, is because we constantly learn and respond to what works. And actually, the idea is trying to find document styles that people who you're presenting this to actually find a way to engage with. So that, as Duncan said, it's trying to find a common language that everybody can get behind, whether it's a metro-style system that is in the local market, or actually we have the road network symbologies that have traffic control flows, or whether it's you know, boxes and arrows, but it's kind of annotated using human behaviour and thought processes of what people are actually doing. But it's anything that, when you present that back to people in your project team, they can really understand, and they, you know, start actually responding back to what you've done. We've seen it so many times where, you know, we present back a user journey like what Duncan was saying, and you suddenly have these icons that represent choice and decisions, and, you know, some senior managers are like, there's a lot of decision making happening here, is that not going to be confusing? You know, we should have less roundabouts and less dead ends, and they suddenly start talking to you on that language because you found common ground, right? And especially because often in sort of digital projects and production, the sort of leading sort of language is often the technology language. So actually, again, the technologists can use this as a way of understanding the UX process too. So the reason we sort of work in this way is because a lot of this output is not the final product, it's not necessarily the final design or the final code, but this is the value-added component to that process. So we have to find a way of making these documents valuable and reusable. So yeah, these are just a couple of the styles, but I think the real theme of it is that we really try and focus on the journey and the person. And you can probably even come up with your own ideas as to how you might want to do that. We've certainly been doing it for a number of years, and it does work very well.
Since the screen size is quite smaller,
sure,
could we get this document like later from a download link or just...
Yeah. I mean, also, I don't know if you guys use Pinterest, for example, or are aware of it, but I mean, even just kind of follow us on Pinterest, because we share a lot of this sort of documentation style on our boards, so you can sort of see them in a bit more sort of larger size, because that way, if we're putting new stuff up all the time, you'll get it, you know. So that's probably a good place to kind of grab it from, because most of this stuff's probably on there already. Yeah, and if it's not, then we'll add some more as well. So.
Yeah. So moving on, as we reach the more kind of design stage. This is...
Would you like to see it? Because I don't need to see the screen, that's fine.
This is an example of a screen flow document that we use, or we used for McDonald's. One of our partners had commissioned us to work on their McDonald's campaign project. One of the largest campaigns in the UK. I don't know whether you spend much time in the UK, but when you go to McDonald's now, there's a Monopoly campaign. And you take your little voucher, and then you enter the code online, and you see if you win, etc. And this is the whole digital experience for that, and we went about designing that. One of the things that we did, one of our approaches was to take the screen flow approach. I don't know whether you guys have worked with that before, but what that enables us to do is very quickly and easily understand not only what things need to be on the page for when you wireframe, but also the flow of the journey the person takes. So going on from the previous deliverable of the tube, this is the next deliverable, but in a more visual and more sort of the next stage. The real sort of the realisation of the detail of what's going to be on each page. So it's a really empowering document. So rather than just going straight into high fidelity wireframing, and breaking the page down individually, like I say, this very quickly and easily allows you to see the whole journey that the person takes in one canvas.
I think that last point about it being on one canvas is really important because, as Duncan said, if you just focus on one page, actually you can quite quickly get lost into the detail of that one home page, and actually the whole idea of wireframing suddenly starts to break down because it's starting to take quite a long time, or you're focusing on it or revising it. And what the whole process of rapid prototyping is really there to do is help you understand quickly the whole thing. So, even on a big project like this campaign here, you can very quickly map out almost the entire site experience in low fidelity wireframes, and that could just be, using wireframes like that. But actually, during our training workshops we had over the last few days, we were doing this, on the whiteboards, and actually just sketching out sort of 10 pages in like 10 minutes, and you just kind of get a quick idea as to where's the flow, how much space is getting used for navigation, what's happening, where's it dropping back below the fold, do we need to think about the mobile grid, and it all starts to flow quickly across the whole thing rather than just page to page. So it's a really sort of great way to work quickly, but also make early sort of test decisions and refine into high fidelity only where you really need it.
Okay, and then kind of research or the usability testing stage. So understanding if our design decisions have been validated and are correct, and making sure that are there any final tweaks that we can make. So here's just an example of typical testing that you've probably been exposed to or know of, or even conducted yourself. The kind of the one-way screen approach, so you can see the user interacting with the product, and without them realising there's anybody in the room opposite to who's observant. So really powerful way to just allow the person to naturally do what they do rather than having to be conscious whether they're being watched or not. So yeah, it just breaks this down into sort of qualitative and quantitative testing. So the two different approaches that we take. From site surveys to actual one-on-one interviews to group sessions at the end. We try and gather all the data not only at the very start of each project, at the very end. It's very critical at this stage to say, are these design decisions that we've made based upon our understanding of the user, our understanding of the requirements, are these correct? Because at this stage there's an opportunity for us to refine it. So whether you've had the time and the budget in your project to create a prototype. So if you create the prototype, it's great, because then whether it's a wireframe prototype or whether it's actually a clickable JPEG prototype, anything you can do to get it in front of a user, and it doesn't necessarily have to be exact replication of your user base. It can be just your colleagues. If your budget, for example, doesn't have the time to or budget have the time and the cost to fully conduct the testing, you're able to just offer it out to your colleagues, offer it to someone else who's not seen this before, and get them to just pick up any usability issues that you weren't aware of. Because as a designer, you're going to be fully engrossed in this for anything up to sort of 2 weeks to 4 weeks to 6 weeks at a time. And having somebody else with a fresh pair of eyes to pick it up and say, this doesn't quite make sense to me. This doesn't really. It's not how I would naturally think about doing it. This is the opportunity to get that sort of insight and to refine it. And then here's an example of our British Heart Foundation, which is one of our projects that we worked on. It's one of our flagship projects. I don't know whether you guys know of the British Heart Foundation, one of the biggest charities in the UK and also around the world. They commissioned us to take their site, which has a huge audience, as you can appreciate. Heart conditions affect everybody in every walk of life. So we were tasked with the process of everything they do and combining it into one page it was heavily research based at the very beginning, and understanding who their groups of people are. You know, there was a lot of information architecture that went into this. From the very early stages, we held a lot of focus groups, and we were able to talk to the end users. The British Heart Foundation were very good in the sense that they gave us many people to talk to, which helped us understand their user base. And this is the end product, and the website's still going strong today. You know, and it's had a fantastic response from the people that have used it.
It's kind of considered really, especially in the UK, like a new benchmark for how charities and non-profit organisations might approach the design of their websites, which are so information heavy, but actually have such a wide audience base, everything from people with a condition through to those who donate, those to professionals who contribute content. But you're only going to design one site and one product experience. So how do you actually balance the needs of all of those without deprioritising people or making them feel alienated, especially because there is a sort of emotional and a health issue at stake at times. So some people may be arriving in distress. So, you know, it was a really interesting project, and by doing, as Duncan explained, you know, a large amount of research, that definitely helped. But at the same time, we had to refine all of that down into a very simple set of decisions about what are the real key motivations that people are driven by, and how do we design just for that, because we can't design for everybody. From the approach we took, I mean, we're not giving you the full case study because of the time, I guess, but you know, that was the real innovative part of the project, is the way we simplified such a complicated number of users into just a sort of handful of key motivations, and then designed it around, you know, those seeking information, those looking to get involved, those who just wanted to get something practical done. And actually we just drove the entire design experience by that kind of attitude, and it was really impactful. And as I say, it became a really good reference case study for what a lot of other sort of large charities are now using to say this is a good standard and best practice. So, yeah, it's a good example.
We've actually got two fairly large projects to talk through now. One's Lumata, who are a marketing agency in London and also globally. They manage a customer base of each customer, each client, and the loyalty scheme. So, for example, I don't know whether Orange, the phone provider, they do this Orange 2 for 1 Wednesday in the UK, where you go to the cinema for 2 for 1, and you receive a text message. The whole text messaging campaign is done through their system. So we were actually commissioned to work on their expression software, and it was a very good project. I mean, we've got a lot of deliverables that we potentially show you, which will help me explain it.
I think just as Duncan digs that out, the context of the project was that they built this system over time, and it was very technology driven in terms of what it functionally does in terms of that sort of text and messaging gateway, but they really saw the potential to explode that out into different forms of messaging, so IP messaging, email, whatever, but for agencies to be able to use a single product to design and build a campaign and all of the response systems within that. And they wanted it to be, high value, market leading product, so a complete re-engineering from the ground up. And as Duncan says, we were fortunate enough to get commissioned to help guide the actual sort of designing of the service. So we had this sort of broad brief of what are they trying to achieve, but actually we took that user-centered approach and a functional approach to say, right, this is actually the best way we could build this product, and then carried on supporting them through the agile delivery of what they were doing in terms of production itself. But it started, as I'm sure Duncan's going to show you, just with some of the early deliverables in the UX process.
So, like I was saying earlier about how, because we've been in the industry for so long, is that we've worked on a model that helps us refine personas down in a more detailed and more effective way to make it more useful for us later on down the line. Now, if you were to attend that training course, you'd be able to understand the full detail of that. But just an example is a persona document we delivered to the client, and this just helps to show a little bit about how we kind of refine that process down. So initially, when we first started, what we did is we listed out all the customer target customer markets that they as Lumata were targeting. So we listed them all out straight away, and then from what we could find, we tried to find a grouping system to help us understand how we could potentially target the right people. So we broke those down to fashion houses, retailers, direct retailers, FMCGs, and brand groups, and then from there we tried to break down which one of those, because the important thing about personas is that you can never target or design for everyone. That's the fundamental, as designers you'll know, because if you try to design for everyone, you just break down very, very quickly. So how do you go about targeting the right people, or the right group of people? So what we did is we first listed them all out, grouped them, and then we targeted the ones that we thought would be a good representation of the overall groups. So from there we chose the likes of Primark for direct retailers, FMCG retailers, we targeted Waitrose. And what we did, we started giving them actual profiles and personas. So we understand who Grace, as marketing manager at Dior, we thought that she would be appropriate in who to target. We gave her a goal, we gave her an objective. We started to understand her personality traits, we started to understand what her criteria to architect around. Each one of these gave us a way to understand who this person and how to target this person. Now if you were to look at this in more detail, we've got on the right hand side here is influencing traits. So here we can sort of on a scale is understand which one is most important, which one isn't important to this particular user. So as an example, because Grace is fairly novice user, she's kind of in between. But what she needs in order to make her job more easier on a day-to-day basis when she's using it is wizards, and having the ability to quickly go through the step-by-step procedure in order to get her campaign out. We figured that this would be one of the most important things for her, so it was right at the end of the scale. So we knew that in order to cater for this person, wizard, for example, would be an important thing to design for her. I won't go down to each individual one, but you can sort of understand a little bit how we've managed to, from the influencing features, is trying to understand how and why we should target our design decisions around that person. So yeah, that's a persona document.
What if you're working on a product outside your market and you have to make personas for somebody from a different region? Obviously they have different cultures and that affects greatly. So how do you go about doing that?
We're very lucky at Entropii. We have quite a range of staff from all different types of backgrounds. So each one understands a little bit about different cultures. Now, we're not going to say we know everything about them, but what we try and do is research. Whether that's trying to get people on a focus group or get them on one-on-one interviews to try and understand who they are, we gather their insights that way. We have Natty is a PhD student and she's a researcher at Entropii, and she would either conduct the interviews or sit at the side and just observe that person, just understand how they are as a person, and understand what might motivate them. We target our questions specifically around trying to get the right answers for what we need to know about that person for that particular project. It's very tailored within each project, as you guys will know. Any project you work on is very, very different. But it's about understanding what you need to know initially, and then asking those questions to who you think is a target representation of the end user.
Yeah, kind of getting in front of the, if you like, your customer's customer is sometimes can be quite hard, especially either culturally or within the kind of business that you're working in. The attitude or the appetite to do that isn't really there. So, I think Duncan's going to probably touch on this client in a moment, but just our client in Saudi Arabia, for example, we had that sort of situation where they were very keen to get us involved, so that's great, you've got an open mind to a degree about user experience, but we weren't able to go about the full cycle the way we would normally do. So we weren't going to get an opportunity to talk to the end audience. We had a lot of briefing and specification and a lot of work that the business analysts had done to say this is what we're trying to achieve. But actually, whilst we were there, we were finding opportunities to speak to stakeholders within the organisation, not to actually just find out what they want, but trying to get them to tell us, what do you know about your customer? So at least even using them as like a proxy in that sense, to say, okay, can we meet with someone from client services or from customer support? You know, these are the guys who are dealing with the problems on a day-to-day basis. And we were talking to them and just saying, right, what are the customers complaining about? Is it speed? Is it performance? Is it, you know, the fact that it takes too long to get everything done, or they get lost very easily, or it crashes all the time? And, you know, none of that's written in the business spec at all. But actually, we were just trying to find ways of understanding it from their perspective. So that can be a really good way to get at least started in finding out the end user's situation, because there's always going to be someone who has that dialogue. It might not be you, it might not even be getting in front of them, but as you start to show an interest in that, actually there's opportunities to find ways of increasing that over time. Take for example, if you did that through colleagues and then made a design decision, and that design decision became a good, you know, an output, then your colleague might respect your decision the next time when you say, we could do with actually holding a focus group, or actually if you're going to the next conference with the customers, could you ask, you know, could you add these 2 extra questions onto the normal surveys that you do? And it's just trying to introduce ways to get them involved in the process, because then they can not only see the value you produce as a designer, but also it increases your value as a designer in the process too, because they understand the value that it's going to bring. And especially, I mean, this kind of crossover area of UX is fantastic, because, so, you know, previously to UX, sort of technology and design and business and client, it was all very disconnected, and we really feel as though UX is the binding process in that. And also, that's why we try and work with documents that act as that binding reference. So everything from a persona you can create and send to the sales team and say, this is what we think of the client. And they'll say, no, that's not right. And because they're kind of forced to have to start giving you some feedback because you've maybe used the wrong information. Or actually they say, yeah, that's really good, we didn't really think of that. Or you've identified a market that's quite low priority, but actually we could do with maybe selling to them more. So it's interesting that you said they, you know, are motivated by the same things as our other team. Maybe we should just put more effort in. And it just becomes, you know, that's a bad example, but you just find ways of creating a totally new level of dialogue. And that's really what experience design is about, is designing beyond just the sort of visual impact. I mean, again, you know, we've got a lot more content on this in our training courses that we do, but the sort of the key point really is that UI is not UX, you know. And I think, you know, some of you guys are going to already appreciate that, but it takes time to kind of get other people to start understanding that. But, you know, it's our responsibility as designers to find ways to start introducing them to that, because when you do, they are likely to start finding business value in this as well.
Yeah, I think Hammad makes a good point about you know, interviewing stakeholders early on. You know, in any project you get, budget can be quite tight, and especially in a region where, you know, UX isn't you know, commonly known, or you might not see the value in it. But if you know the value in it as the designer, and you can even, if you can try and contact even someone within their organisation who speaks to the end client on a daily basis, you know, who do they talk to? And if you manage to get them even for a phone call for half an hour, just ask them who their clients are, and, you know, and how do they react to certain things, what frustrates them, you know, and just trying to gather that insight from internally, because you might not, for example, for every project be able to speak to an end user. It is very, very difficult. But anyone you can speak to is better than nobody.
It's also just using other things like online surveys, right? So again, even culturally, people might not be open to kind of sharing their opinion. In fact, we found this on a project when we were in South Korea. So actually, again, there was a driving force behind the project to improve their website, because it was a global business. It's like literally a big corporation in South Korea, and they were, you know, having to represent themselves globally. So they understood that they've got to take a market perspective, but actually when you're out there, their culture is very reserved, and they don't want to share. And you know, it's very easy for us to walk in and say, right, we need to have a focus group with the senior management. And actually, even when we just had the first briefing, it's obvious that they're not going to say anything. You know, and so even though we weren't holding the focus group, they just weren't sharing, and we were asking them, and they were like, yeah, maybe. And you know, so we respond to that by understanding that, look, it's not within the culture to actually be open, but actually what they find is that they will tell their subordinates the information, and then you get it through them. So we started using more of their project team to actually say, look, this is what we want to know. Can you find this out from them? And they'll find it out in a personal way. They only really like to speak very one-to-one. So we did just in a meeting, senior management just like to listen. They don't like to contribute. So what we started doing over the week was just holding briefings about what we're trying to achieve, so they understood, and then they'd leave, and then they told their subordinates what they want out of it. Because we wouldn't have shared it openly. And on other projects, as I said, you can maybe use online surveys because maybe the market is actually reserved or difficult to get in front of. But they might actually give you information if you can get a survey out with half a dozen simple questions and see that out via Twitter and Facebook or in sort of community groups that's more relevant to where they already hang out rather than asking them to come to a place that you own, like your website or your office or whatever. So that's another good way of doing it.
Unfortunately, the example that I used previously was also used through Fullermato as well. So this is it shows that this is an actual project delivery. So what's different with this one is that we've actually used the personas mindsets and kept this within the documentation. So again, like Hammad said earlier, it's about humanising each document and understanding the person. And we managed to keep that at each stage. We're actually, where we can, in the wireframe document, we'll have a little icon that just represent the user. Which journey they've gone on, so it just represents back to, so each time you can link it back. One thing I didn't show you actually on the persona deck is, one thing we've been doing for our clients just recently is to have little QR codes in each of the personas. People then can quickly scan the QR code, because we're going to put it on each of the documents. So at any time they can scan it on their phone and bring it up, and they can flick through and go, oh yeah, okay, so that was John. I remember John. He was a middle-aged guy, and he was struggling with computers, and this needed to be novice. He needed loads of tips, etc. So it's just a good point to make is in any of our documentation and in any of your documentation is to try and keep that user focus, that mindset at each stage. In one of our in other documents where we've got the flight symbology or the road symbology, each step we have what the user's thinking at that step as well. So not only at the very beginning so you know that they've achieved their objective, but each step, 1, 2, 3, 4, what they're thinking now. Because each different step, they're going to be thinking something different. And you can understand there whether you've made the right decision or not. How could you make that journey a little bit easier? Could you maybe shortcut a route down? You maybe deep dive the user into the content they wanted from the very moment they landed on the page. So just manage to keep that user at the forefront of your mind.
Really good way to start getting used to doing this is actually logging and auditing something you already have in this way, because that's just as useful a way of doing sort of usability testing or analysis is actually taking an existing website or an app or a project that you have and actually starting to design the current user journey, and actually it starts to highlight the areas that might need to change, and whether that's because you're actually preparing for a project or whether you actually make a business case to other colleagues to say, actually we're focusing on registration but the real issue is checkout or whatever, and so you start to actually have a visual reference that also divorces it from the graphical representation, because as soon as something becomes visual and sort of graphically designed, we form an emotional connection to it. We like it, we hate it, it's on brand, whatever. So it's being able to break down the design decisions into a sort of semi-scientific sort of process, but also using sort of common language in terms of symbology as something we can discuss openly, helps us really focus on what's happening. So if this is maybe something new to you, I don't know, maybe you already do some of this, but if you haven't, then start using it as a referencing tool for what you have, rather than trying to figure out how would I use this to design what I want next. And you'll really quickly be able to see, oh wow, actually by mapping out what we've got right now, it's so obvious that we've got registration at the wrong point of the process, for example.
Okay.
Are we on Elm finally? Or?
Yeah, so a couple more deliverables to show you, but we then went on with this project to produce the wireframes, with high-fidelity wireframes, and then onto the graphical design of it. So this actually used a kind of tile approach to campaign building. So you go through different steps and opens up in a nice little tile. So if you use Google Search recently, you'll notice that that's now a tile search, and you click it and it opens up. We actually did this UI design before Google Search came out. Well, not before it came out, but before that sort of design had been implemented. and which made the client very, very happy because they were like, oh, Google are doing it now, and that makes their project very innocent. So it's good. So yeah, as you can see, it's a fairly nice design, very complementary in its colour palette, and hopefully visually pleasing to the end user. If we had more designs on us, we'd be able to show the sort of more intricate detail into how we've catered for the users, because in each stage, even if it's down to the little tips we give them on the stage, we've catered for different users. Unfortunately, I don't have any further detail to
Have you got any of the creative on this?
this is it.
Oh, yeah. I thought you showed the wireframe. Okay, yeah.
So yeah, so move quickly on, because I'm conscious of time.
Are we okay for time? I mean, we don't know, what you guys' expectations are. Maybe
okay.
5-10 minutes more to show you just another quick client project.
Yeah, sure. So our next client is Al Elm. I'm not sure whether you guys have heard of Al Elm before, but in Saudi Arabia they provide a lot of e-services for citizens on passports, visas, etc. For end users and for clients who wanted to get people visas, employees visas, etc. So this was a project that lasted around 6 months. It was a bit longer than we anticipated. It was only meant to be a short project, but through how projects kind of happen and span over time, it kind of went on for a bit longer than we expected. I don't actually have any personas with me, unfortunately, to show you, but what I do have is
So Hammad, if you have to explain it like the whole process, can you explain in like 2-3 lines the whole process from day first to day end? How it goes, the research and the next step, wireframe and next step.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if we've got that in the UCD cycle at some point, but yeah, basically, as Duncan said, we follow the sort of user-centered design life cycle. So the idea around users in the centre, but also iterative process. So typically, in terms of deliverable output that we produce, so through the discovery stage, our sort of main delivery document is the persona. So whereas other parts of discovery and requirements will form their own documents, like a spec or whatever comes out of the business analysts, as a user experience designer, our discovery document is the persona. That's the bit we want to use as the sort of starting point of research to say, right, this is actually what we guide with. Beyond that, we move into the user journey, so more the sort of flowed system to say, actually, how does this all map out? And actually, we focus really on user journeys as the core of information architecture. So without, again, going into too much detail, you're probably used to sort of thinking of information architecture as a sitemap and like a two-dimensional sort of tree kind of at the top and it kind of goes into sections. And we really moved away from thinking of architecture that way because it doesn't tend to reflect human experience very well, because it kind of forces you to think in a linear manner, whereas actually even as yourselves as web users, you probably find you kind of weave your way through it whichever way you want. So actually all of that work that's gone into organising it logically, it doesn't matter to the user because they kind of move through it randomly anyway. So actually if you try and understand that random thinking, because of its more human-centric approach, you design a journey. And actually by designing sensible journeys, you organically end up with the information architecture. So actually you have is like a hybrid of all these journeys, and that's a much more fluid arrangement of your information architecture. And not only are you talking about pages, but also page interactions, content maybe that influences that, and also technology or functions that fit into that. So the whole architectural document becomes much more powerful, and it becomes, as I said before, a sharing process with technical teams or business teams or customer teams, because you can include them in that as well, or use their specs to influence what you're producing. From that is really about starting the interface work, and going back to the point that UI is not UX, but actually it's a kind of course it's a fundamental part of it. So the screen flow approach, which I think you're going to show on our Elm in a moment, is really the way we like to start our initial UI thinking, is that rapid form, not just about what's the home page or what's the navigation, but very quickly, how is the whole thing going to work? So it's almost answering all the questions right at the beginning, because otherwise it's going to take forever, and you will constantly be fighting through revisions and change, or or various stakeholders. Whereas actually, if we can show them everything very quick, we can drill into the key issues and deep dive where we need to. And actually, we're more confident that it's going to have a flow. So even in phase 2 in next year's release, we've started thinking about it high level. And so, you know, beyond the low fidelity screen flow, you can then do high fidelity detailed wireframes and annotate them and talk about pixel perfect sort of layout and use that as a creative brief to a visual designer and say, right, this is the sort of schematic of what I want it to be, and talk about interaction design and, you know, how the drop down behaves, or is the search going to be an auto search and it comes up with the options as you type. That's the interaction design layer, but you can do that within your wireframe. Now, whether you use a static wireframe or a prototype tool, doesn't really matter, it's whatever you're confident with. And yeah, from there into the creative process, at whatever stage in that you introduce usability testing is down to both experience and budget. So everything from formal lab and eye tracking studies in research through to at the very end to validate what you've done. So it depends what's appropriate, but it could also just be as informal as showing the JPEGs to your client over coffee and just saying, what about this? And they say, it's never going to work in that colour scheme. And you're like, okay, fine, you know, or whatever it's going to be. So just finding opportunity, that's testing. I mean, even that is testing, right? So just trying to use that iterative idea into it, and then finally into whatever the production process is. And often in software development, that ends up becoming agile, so that's fine. So some of that documentation, you maybe deliver it in stages, but go, you know, think about if you're having to deliver in stages, you never have that opportunity to think holistically. So the journey and also this ScreenFlow format allows you to get that quick. So you know, even though it's going to be 3 months before you're working on a particular part, you've started thinking of that and also set the expectations for the production team as to what might be coming.
It was really good, the ScreenFlow document at the time, because as Hammad said, it was at the time when we arrived in Saudi Arabia, we were welcomed by the client, and it was really nice, they were really welcoming, etc. And then we were just literally dumped with a huge requirement deck, so not that thick, but you know, you can understand it was very, very thick, and there's so much requirements, so much to break down. You know, the timescale was quite a short timescale to get through. So we kind of broke up all the timescales, all the requirements to user stories, and then prioritised them. And then what we were able to do whilst doing that is get a good understanding of what the system needs to do. Now, what we also wanted to feel is to feel progress, and we were conscious that the client was wanting to feel progress as well. So one thing we did was to produce a ScreenFlow document, because it allowed us very, very quickly to start flowing out this journey. And it's a shame I don't have the document, but we knew what brief was going to be on the page, but we just showed it with boxes. Didn't matter the detail at this stage. All we need to understand is what the next step was for the user. It was very quick and very easy, and we also understood how the navigation was briefly going to work very quickly. And then literally that was produced within sort of 24 hours or something. And we showed the client, and instantly the project manager was just like, whoa, this is a great start, guys. Like, this is perfect. Keep up this momentum. So it was really, really good. And you know, we'll share with you on Pinterest and stuff little snapshots of the document, so that you guys could use it in your projects, where you know that the pressure's on to get deliverables to the clients, but you don't want to go into the full detail of a full high fidelity wireframe. You want to just show perhaps how the whole flow and get an understanding of the system as a whole.
It's also about being proud of our own work, right? I mean, being designers, you know, it's disappointing when you work on a project, you know it could be better, when you're having to deliver it in a particular manner, so you lose interest, or when the client, you know, the project manager says, build this screen or make this button, you're like, yeah, fine, whatever, we'll make it. You know, and because you don't have any kind of passion involved anymore, because you know you're not influencing the design the way you want it. So, you know, working in that rapid form quickly gives you at least a bit of confidence to say, right, I've very quickly outlined how the whole thing's going to fit together. And there's a lot of detail, and there's all the, you know, the graphics and the banners and the navigation to figure out, but I can be happy that the overall structure is the way I want it to be. And we can at least go from there. So even as it evolves over time, the basic sort of layout and the structure of the UI is the way I want it to be as a designer, and that's not only in my opinion, but I've done it for what I know the user will respond well to. And over time, you know, certain parts of the project will get more investment and others won't get as much, but you'll be happy that it still has a basis of success in there, that you can feel proud that you've influenced. And it's just so much more of a better way to engage in the projects, rather than feeling as though design is a less valuable part of of what you're doing. And even if it takes time to get your whole team and colleagues or clients fully up to speed with what experienced design is adding to it, we've found time and again, because we had the same thing in London, 10 years ago, no one cared. So it takes time, but it's very difficult for anyone to really sort of go against user-centric thinking when you start presenting it back to them. So maybe, you've got people who are very reluctant and they say no, 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 but as soon as you start putting it in front of them, other colleagues as well will suddenly start challenging that one person who's a bit more stubborn and saying, yeah, but that seems to make sense, so what's your problem? And before you know it, you kind of shift the argument the other way, and actually, even if all you're doing is presenting and not being too harsh about it, you're just showing a sensible approach. So back to that scientific approach to creative thinking means that you've just got a validity behind the design decisions you're taking. You're just taking design more seriously. And for me, I feel this sort of approach is really what design is always meant to be about. Design is about finding compromise and also about addressing a design challenge rather than just aesthetics or just sort of applying, what we call, putting lipstick and makeup on top of something to make it look nice. It's never going to have the same effect as if it was properly thought through.
Just going back to your question, so kind of the practicality of running this on a day-to-day project. There's typically two approaches we have. The kind of typical methodological approach to user experience design. It's step by step. Your discovery stage, your experience stage, your creation, usability, and the final implementation. But what you guys may experience on a kind of more practical day-to-day basis is kind of the agile approach. And I imagine one of the difficulties you get is trying to get a user experience approach to agile. Funnily enough, the Marta project that we showed you earlier was done in an agile way. So the client knew they had this huge scope, but they couldn't. They had also had a development team waiting, and but they had no designs or anything ready. So they couldn't wait 2, 3, 4 months for the designs and everything to be ready. They had to get started, and I'm sure you feel that pain quite a lot. So one of the tricks that we've learned as we've gone about working with Marta and other clients in an agile approach is starting with a sprint zero. Start with a sprint zero, understand the overall scope of the project, and then you can sort of break it down into little chunks where you can work on a certain section of the site, and then to produce the wireframes, the designs, so that the development team can get cracking on a 2-week schedule, for example. And in that next 2 weeks, whilst they're developing, you can be producing the wireframes and producing the designs for the next sprint. So, it's as long as you start with that sprint zero to understand the overall scope of the project, you can make those or understand the design decisions at the early stage, even at sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, sprint 4. So, just want to touch on that.
Yeah, that's really well.
I have one question about the route map that you showed. That was for underground subway stations.
Yeah.
Right. So, how did you find that this will work out for the larger audience? Because if it's for UK, then they have so many multicultural people there, lots of background, and not like South Korea, in which you have one focus group, one group that you are designing for. In UK, there are a whole bunch of people out there from around the world.
Yeah.
So how did you find that this will work out, and this is the way that you need to go?
So just to be clear about where these documents are used. So this is just the journey architecture document, right? So the idea of the metro system being used had nothing to do with the way it would be on the final front end, because of course that's not how the product is being positioned. It was only a visual language to use to help describe the information architecture so that those on the project team could understand it. So in that particular case, even though there was a mixed community in the client team at Lumata, they were all Londoners, so they were able to understand the London metro system, and we talked to them about all the journeys and how they interconnect and where certain tasks
It wasn't for the end user.
It wasn't for the end user. It was about how do we communicate our architectural plan to our client in a way that they will understand it. Because that's all this document is. Once it's done, it will get lost and the graphics and the code will take over. So this is only a part of the process. But if it was a two-dimensional site map or a grey document that was very difficult to understand, or a flow chart that maybe looked a bit more technical, you would never really get the feeling of the coloured lines being used to represent different areas, or the stations to represent where users cross from one task to another, and actually using a common language that, because they use that metro system every day, they can understand the pain that people might go through when you have to change station either by choice or because something went wrong. And so it was just a common reference. Now, in South Korea, for example, we knew that, again, the client was very much going to be a local audience. And so even though their project was going to have a global appeal, if we came in and started talking to them using a London tube map, they wouldn't know what the hell is going on. So we used the highway and road network system. So before going out, we just spent a bit of time, and the internet is a fantastic place, you can find out almost anything. And before going out to South Korea, we said, what are the actual icons, what do the signs on the roads look like in South Korea? So what do they use to represent, traffic lights? What do they use to represent junctions, or turnings, or no entry? And it's, slightly different style to in the UK or in the US. And just by creating half a dozen icons, which you can do very quickly, we were able to piece together our suggestions in real time when we were on site, after the briefings we had, and present it back to them within 2 days and say, here's how it works. And it had such an impact because we were talking to them on their terms, rather than trying to get them to understand how we do it. So that's the point, is you're trying to understand the person you're talking to and deliver it to them in a way that is relevant for them. And so that was a great way of just transporting the sort of same system we might use in the UK, but just tailoring it. We could do the same thing here in the UAE. We noticed that actually a lot of the highway symbols are very similar to the UK, but the subtle difference, if we create icons that look exactly like the local market, and presented that to a client, they would just feel as though this was relevant for them, rather than they being forced down a process that is not relevant for them. And that's where really the air travel system is really where our latest focus is, because obviously you have the crossover challenge. So what if the client has a mix of audiences and they don't understand the local market languages, or the project also has that international audience, and how are you going to work with that? So that's where we've developed this kind of passport system. So actually just using the idea of defining our audience as passports. So it's the key facts: who are they, how old are they, where do they work, and actually the key words that they are needing to have as part of their journey. We just design it so it looks like stamps on their visa. So we call it conditions for travel. So if I'm a traveller, I'm expecting this to be fast, fun, and quick, right? And you just stamp it to look like a visa on the passport. And you see straight away that that's actually the way that you think about going on a trip. You have to pre-decide what you need for that trip before you take it. But it's attached to who you are and what you want from the trip. And same again with the goals and objectives being, your boarding card. You need that to decide what you're going to do. And just using a language that, even though it has no relevance to the final way the graphics will work, but it's a system that everybody can share and understand. And you can start staying in mind of, we've got people and they're going to take a journey. And you don't have to explain a road network or a symbol or anything like that to anybody, because you're just talking about travelling. And before you know it, you've got senior management giving you feedback to say, wouldn't his passport need this, or wouldn't actually his conditions of travel need that? And they straight away start using the language very quickly, because you've used something that they didn't need to understand. We haven't got it there to show you, but we've taken that into the journey as well. So again, using that airport style of reference, because an airport actually is a system, and it has almost an organised flow. You're deliberately taken through check-in to boarding to security and customs. So actually, they all have sort of graphics and icons and colour schemes, with a certain amount of international consistency. And you can use that just to tailor the process as well as the passport. And the final thing, as Duncan mentioned, with the persona that we have, we showed the example, but actually we built that actually using an app. So we're actually investing in an app that creates personas now. And actually when you output the persona, no longer is it a PDF document, but it's actually a URL, and it's a responsive page. So that's why if you put that same QR code on the wireframes 3 weeks later from the project, you just need to scan it and you see the persona real time on your phone. And actually that could be in a client meeting or in a management meeting to say, why have you done that? Doesn't make any sense. They say, well look, that's what the persona wants. Really? You say, yeah, look, I'll show you. And even if they can't do it, you can just bring it up and they can have that reference whilst they're reviewing something else. Or you can have that reference as you're having a debate as to what you need to change later. So it's all about how do we make these documents more reusable over time, because otherwise a common mistake we see certainly with personas is people make them and then forget about them. So they no longer have value. So I mean we're a design consultancy, so that's what we really invest our time in, is finding innovative ways to sort of enhance and improve the UX process. But for you guys, we just wanted to share some of the way that looks, and maybe either inspire you or get your feedback at some point as to how you might do it differently, because we're all on the same team.
Sure.
I think that's about it, isn't it?
That's about it.
Yeah, it's great.
Sounds good.
Thanks, guys. Well, thanks for having us here as well. It was nice to.
Any questions, anyone?
Sure. How do you manage business needs with user needs? So if the business needs differ from what the user needs, and how do you balance between the two?
Yeah, I think, certainly from what we know about the sort of region here, I think it's about sort of taking time to sort of find more ways to find a compromise. So I think just first of all, understanding and hearing the story from both points of view has got to be the starting point, because otherwise all you're doing is taking the business need and responding to it. So even if you just start to introduce the user need from the beginning in whatever format, that at least builds your understanding. Even if you're not actually able to directly respond to a change for that, but you'd understand maybe where the problem or the pressure points lie. And later on in a conversation, or when you're doing a review of the project 6 months later, or even just having a coffee with someone else in the team, you can give them that perspective and say, did you know, actually the users think this about it, and we've gone about it the wrong way. And it's just starting to build the awareness. So I think that's probably the first process, is actually just starting to increase the awareness of what is the user thinking. What we find, and certainly even in different sort of cultural regions, is as soon as people start to actually even think about the end user, it is very difficult to start ignoring it on top. Because actually, even in London, it's no different. Every business gets obsessed with what they want. So they do forget the user. And it seems for us sometimes almost a really simple and stupid point to make to people, to say, think about the user first. It's like, it's so obvious. But actually, 99% of people don't do that. So even just trying to get a little bit of that introduced starts to have a big impact. And it's, even a business analyst or a CEO or whoever, as soon as you just flip the question the other way and just say, okay, that sounds fantastic. What do the users want, or how are they going to respond to that? Or what about the low-tech audience who we have a large amount of complaints for? What are they going to think? And it just starts to get everybody used to using a user as a reference. Because at the moment, it doesn't happen at all. And you can also assume that, well, if we give the user this function, they'll be happy with it. Which they might, but actually the way you present that function to them is the difference as to whether they use it all the time, whether they tell other people about it, and whether or not they're actually confident about doing it again. And so this is where you start getting into really the business benefits. And certainly if you're working in, I don't know obviously where you guys all work, but if you were agency side or in any kind of service delivery side, it's really about how does user experience add to the bottom line. And actually there's a huge and growing amount of research globally being produced and communicated about how that's what it does. It's also why user experience is growing as an industry. It's not just because everyone thinks it would be cool to complicate the process. Actually, it's because going through this mechanic will actually start changing the dynamics of the output, and therefore giving competitive advantage to those organisations who do it that way. So actually, if there's you start to increase the appetite for the benefit that it will have, and over time you find the conversation increases, the awareness increases, and that's where you really start to better balance user versus business need, all the way to the point where, on a dream project, it starts with user need, and then you look at to say, what, depending on what the users want, what should we produce? It's going completely the other way. But it takes time, and not every project is like that. And certainly for us, we get the whole mix. We get clients who say, we need a UX agency, but they don't understand any of what that means, and it's our responsibility to guide them. And sometimes you have to take shortcuts. That's why we call ourselves an experience design consultancy, because we're not a graphic design house, we're not a technology shop, and we're not a usability agency. because experience design is about the reality of what happens in all three of those spaces. So you work with what you have, and you understand the influence it will have, but at the same time you be realistic and you don't try and change the world in one day. So actually it's interesting to get involved. Some projects will be more fun or have better impact than others, but overall you build an attitude in your team or in as yourself to say, this is actually the approach that I take, and even one amount of change will be better. You know, certainly, you know, working in different cultures, that's the response we get. Is even having a client who wants to go through a wireframing process before jumping straight into design just gives it one more step of opportunity to improve the product before it gets to the end. Or a client who isn't going to let you do any kind of research and focus groups, but you know, is maybe willing to do some usability testing of what they have today in order to then get an expert opinion what happens next. So you can't go back and say, well, you're not following the whole life cycle, so get lost. You know, you appreciate the fact that every step in this direction is even going to improve it even 1% more. And that's our responsibility as designers, is to stimulate that response and also react to it. And thankfully, we've got increasing demand globally for UX, and so I'm sure there's going to be more and more opportunities to actually do it the right way. But, you know, it takes time. But it's certainly a lot different to 12 months ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think if it's still early days in the momentum, it's only going to get better.